Hello, everybody. We've been doing a lot of shows these days about what's wrong with America. Lots of people have strong views. We did one with the Financial Times' columnist, Simon Cooper, who believes that there's so much wrong with America that it's time for Americans to move to Europe. And other guests agree, like Jason Pack, another expatriate American who has left the United States because of, he believes, too many reasons for what's wrong with America. But not everyone, of course, is in the Pack Cooper camp. Others, like my guest today, Larry Aldrich, is the co-author of an upcoming new book, What's Right with America? The book is written with the Honorable Paul Johnson, and Larry Aldrich is joining us from Scottsdale in Arizona. Larry, nice to have an optimist on the show.
Nice to be an optimist in life, Andrew.
Larry, I'm sure you're all too familiar with the pessimism around America, both inside and outside America. What would you say to guys like Cooper and Jason Pack, who have essentially given up on America, on the promise of America?
Well, if they have completely given up, I would say maybe they want to move somewhere else. And I think Jason indicated that's the choice for him. There is so much right with America, and we just simply thought it was now the time to remind people about how much right there is with America, how we are so fortunate to be born here and to live in this country. So that's the main part of our book was, if we look at the data, we look at the history, we look at the facts, and we get away from the contention and the fear and the disquieting side and the politics, and really get back to the history. You can see how strong America is, and really we spent a lot of time. We can get into that, Andrew, into the founding of America and to how the founders. This is not an accident. They designed America the way it's working, and that they have built a country around the power of individuals. And that is the unique issue for America, that individuals are the power in America. We have the rights, for freedoms, and responsibilities to be the best we can be. And over 250 years, we have all been pretty damn great.
Larry, I don't think anyone would argue about the foundations of America. And I take your point about its foundations, the Constitution, maybe we'll get into that, rights, the roles of the different branches of government. But every country declines historically. Every great power eventually declines, whether it's China of antiquity, Rome, Greece, United Kingdom. Why are you suggesting that America can't decline? Is there something inevitable in your view about American foundations and the supposed vitality of contemporary America?
I think there is. I mean, I'm never going to say it's impossible that America will never decline. That would just be, I have no clue, and I won't be here to see that happen. But because of the foundations, because of the structure, we call the rule of law that exists in America, what we call the scaffolding of democracy. Because of that focus on the individuals, and in our book, Andrew, we talk about the 5 core traits of America, which we have described as courage, imagination, grit, generosity, and optimism. And because of those traits, we have built in this country a structure that enables us to continue to be great and continue to empower individuals. And we have had many, many decades, many, many eras where people talked about the decline of America. You go back in history, you can see it. The World Wars, the Depression, the Civil War, of course, and yet we continue to come out stronger. We have the benefit of the fact that we have been through tough times and been resilient and recovered. Other countries that are kind of early in their democracy journey, sometimes they hit a tough moment and they can't recover. So I think there is almost a movement underneath the current of America that enables us to pull ourselves out of what looks in the short term to be very desperately bad times.
You tell me a little bit about your co-author, Paul Johnson, who I'm not quite sure why is he described as the Honorable Paul Johnson. Tell me about him and your partnership in terms of writing this book.
Sure, happy to. And honorable is the honorific because he's the former mayor of Phoenix. And that just kind of is, as we typically say for secretaries or ambassadors, often we say the honorable people that are elected. Paul was a mayor and city councilman in Phoenix a number of years ago. That picture is about when he was there, and hasn't been that for a while. But he is just a force of nature in the Arizona area. Has developed now a podcast called The Optimistic American at optamerican.com. And that podcast really has, for the last several years, focused on the data, focused on the history, focused on getting out of the opinion of how things are wrong and talk about why things are right. And so Paul's been on this journey longer than I have. He's a running buddy of mine. And one day we were running and I said, I think you need a book. I think you need to reach the market, the book. And he goes, I would love to write a book as long as you'll write it and I'll co-write it. And so I said, I'm in. And so that's kind of how we got started.
I always judge a book. There's, of course, the cliche, Larry, that judge a book by its cover. But I always judge a book by its dedications. It tells you about why people wrote it. Paul dedicated the book to Wesley Clark, a very distinguished American general. You dedicate the book to somebody quite honestly I'd never heard of, Jim Click Jr. Tell me why you dedicate this book about what's right about America to Jim Click Jr.
So Jim Click he is also a force of nature. He is probably a once in 10 generation leader, just happens to live in Tucson, just found his way to Tucson and became a car dealer and a banker, a hardcore member of the Republican Party. And I've been a hardcore libertarian for a long time. He is a man with a heart of gold who really believes in the Republican Party. But, his social leadership, in addition to his business leadership and his political leadership, I would say he's certainly a friend. I would call him a mentor in terms of how to be a better leader. So it's my honor to know him, and it was my honor to dedicate it to him. In fact, I'm going to see him on May 2nd and bring him the first copy of our book.
So would you say that in Jim Click Jr., somehow what's right about America is all incorporated? If we were to interview him, what would resonate with our audience, do you think?
I think a lot would resonate with me because, as you see from that little shot there, he's from Oklahoma, so he's got a little bit of the Oklahoma in him. His dad was a car dealer in Tucson, Boom Pa. So these were folks that spent a lot of time on television selling cars, and then later on television selling banking services. And he is probably known to more people in Tucson than any other leader I can imagine, including the president of the University of Arizona.
Larry, some people are going to be watching this and thinking, we admire Larry and Paul's optimism, but they're describing a different America, maybe the America of the 20th century, an industrial America, America that was leading the world. Today in 2025, the America that they imagine no longer exists. How would you respond to that critique?
I think they're wrong. The early part of our book, we start with the story of the moon landing, and Paul was younger than I was, and came back to watch the moon landing in Arizona. I was in New York. I was coaching Little League for my brother. Both of us listening at the time. Both of us at a time when the moon landing stopped the entire world, and almost everyone who had access to a television or a radio, obviously pre-internet days, stopped, paused, and admired the leadership of America. And, from that moment forward, a number of us, we said, what are we going to do? I went to, I wanted to become an aeronautical engineer. I went to engineering college, ended up becoming a lawyer, but it kind of underscored for me the opportunity across America. I do not think America's best days are in the rear. They are in the future.
I take the point, Larry, but some people again might say, well, that's all very well. There's no doubt that the American moon landing was a remarkable achievement, but that was in 1969. That's almost 60 years ago. I mean, is that the last time that we can point to something that America accomplished that makes it such a leading power in the world?
No, of course not. I don't know where you were, Andrew. I know where I was. I was in front of my computer watching Elon Musk's SpaceX grab that rocket with the chopsticks. That was October of 24. And I will tell you, as a person who wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, to see that happen made me cry. The problem was most of the media, most of the world didn't pay attention to that accomplishment, which is breathtaking in what it accomplished. And those innovations, we've now really moved those innovations in many ways to the private sector, whether it's Tesla, whether it's SpaceX, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Google. You go down the list of inventions. Look at the mRNA vaccinations with Pfizer and Moderna and others. I mean, we kind of forget that because everyone is now wrapped up in the political environment we're in and worrying about and fighting online. And we forget those amazing accomplishments really are happening literally every day across America. And they're happening, more often across the world, in part because America has been very generous in helping many parts of the world be more successful because it's a benefit to us. So I think we could sit here and go down and get a list off the top of our head in the 50s or hundreds of incredible accomplishments since the moon landing. Our innovation has continued to be remarkable, and our imagination. Those core traits that we have in our book, one of them is imagination. To imagine and do in America the impossible becomes the possible.
So are you suggesting, Larry, I wasn't entirely clear, you mentioned earlier that you were a libertarian and a loyal Republican. Are you suggesting that we should celebrate the shift, if you like, from NASA, which achieved the 1969 landing on the moon, to Elon Musk's SpaceX and the privatization, a lot of these initiatives? Or are you suggesting that we need to recreate, or we Americans need to recreate, government organizations like NASA that are able to achieve national greatness?
And I should clarify, I'm a libertarian, but not a Republican, not a Democrat, and move back and forth across those political spectrums. There's no question that SpaceX and what it has accomplished could not have accomplished what it did without the founding of NASA and the work that was done. The ability to put people in space safely, even though we lost a number of lives in that process, the private sector might have been willing to take the risk. And I don't think Americans would take that cost of losing many more Americans. So I think NASA and what it built earlier in the 20th century was a huge foundation for SpaceX. But now I do believe that the private sector can do things much more efficiently and effectively. So it's probably a pretty good partnership, but shifting more private sector to enable those kind of activities to be more successful and take the next leaps forward. So I think it's both and, but I think the timing was such that SpaceX, I don't believe, could have been successful in the 60s in the same way that NASA was. And I think NASA can't be successful in the way that SpaceX will be in the future.
I would suggest people who are in two minds about this issue might read your book that you wrote with Paul Johnson, What's Right with America, in conjunction with another new book by Rhode Island-based writer Mark Dunkelman, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back in America. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book, but it's an argument that's being made broadly, not just by Dunkelman, but he makes it very well. The example he uses is why California has failed to establish high-speed rail, in contrast with China. And his argument is there's far too much regulation. What do you make of Dunkelman's argument? I mean, I'm not sure he's entirely in disagreement with you, but certainly he sees an America wrapped in red tape.
I would agree with that diagnosis that we have created a world of red tape. I mean, real estate being the easiest here. How in the world is it that we cannot build across America more homes for people? Part of the reason is we have this schizophrenic approach that is, on the one hand, we want people to be able to get in a home and build wealth. And on the other hand, we want housing prices to come down. Those are completely inconsistent with getting more people in homes if you want their net worth to come down, except when people pay off their mortgage. So part of that is it's daunting. And I think that's what Why Nothing Works was really the premise that, yeah, and there were incredible leaders at the time who were able to power through and maybe power over, and people might judge that differently than I would. But there are certain things that we need to basically step back and say, we can't slow everything down forever, or we will build nothing that we need. So I think he's got a good idea on that. I think the Abundance book by the folks from the New York Times and the Atlantic are talking about those issues too. And I think it's a diagnosis that the Democrats, and Dunkelman is a Democrat, I believe, are saying that we have to fix ourselves. We have slowed down progress in America. There is no reason that it takes so long and costs so much. And the American public is really kind of fed up with the amount of delay and cost that it takes to build anything important.
Yeah, it's an interesting response, and your argument about home building is really important. We did another show with Yoni Applebaum from the Atlantic, who is a colleague of one of the authors, the co-authors of Derek Thompson of Abundance that he wrote with Ezra Klein, and his book is exclusively about the failure to build and the failure to move. So coming back, Larry, I take your point on the spirit, although it's a little abstract. But apart from SpaceX, what else is right about America in 2025? We've talked about the failure to build high-speed trains. We've talked about the failure to build homes. What's right about America in late April 2025?
Well, I think one of the things that we have a tendency in America to overlook what we have. It's kind of a foundational issue. It's like we go to the store and we buy something, and we certainly expect it to be safe, not hurt us. We expect it to be reasonably priced. We expect not to be ripped off, because there are systems in place to avoid that. If you buy a home, you don't worry about the ground that was leveled and the foundation and the structure and the inspections, all of which play back into the question of how much regulation do you need, because that's kind of a given. But I would say the number one thing that we forget about in America, we've gone 75 years since we have fired off a nuclear weapon in this world. We could have faced nuclear annihilation way before now. And there were times in the 50s and 60s where it seemed likely. But leadership across the world, but especially in America, made sure that didn't happen. But we just kind of assume that's fine. No one should worry about nuclear annihilation, because that's not going to happen. But those are accomplishments, and they're American-led accomplishments, in my opinion, and Paul's opinion, that really have created a foundation for the things that we just accept are in place. We don't even think about them. When we buy, when we do, when we travel, we don't think that have to worry about the road being safe. We don't worry that much about that two cars come to an intersection and no one knows who goes first. Obviously, there's people who violate the law or run a stop sign or run a stoplight, but there's a rule. And that would fundamentally, Andrew, get me back to the importance of the rule of law, because that is the scaffolding to democracy. And I'm a lawyer, so of course I'm biased on that. But without laws, we have chaos. And we have built the structure of law and the ability to resolve disputes peacefully that have created an environment of success in America. And very few countries have that same kind of environment.
I don't want to turn this, Larry, into another conversation about Trump, but it's hard to avoid given what you've said. you argue that what's right about America is that America, because of its commitment to internationalism, has helped ensure that the world wouldn't destroy itself through nuclear war. And I think many people would disagree with that, although you could also, as you note, credit the Russians and the Chinese and the other nuclear powers with this. But of course, the Trump regime now seems to be pulling out of many of these international agreements. You talk about the rule of law. Many critics have argued that the MAGA America is undermining that by not necessarily obeying the rule of law when it comes to what courts have ordered, even the Supreme Court. Is some of that critique fair, do you think?
I think a lot of that critique is fair. And I'll tell you, Andrew, that most mornings I wake up and check what happened yesterday, mostly out of Washington, shudder. I might look in the mirror and go, am I still an optimist today? Yes, I still am, but I am an optimistic. I'm long on optimism, and I'm long on historic optimism. But in the short term, we have had a number of presidents over the 250 years that have created damage, very bad damage that we've recovered from. And, obviously we're seeing a president testing limits, and those limits are testable. And we have a system that allows the testing. You go back to the founders. The founders were pretty wise in realizing that, we have to have checks and balances. We have to have built them into the Constitution because power can corrupt. And if we don't have a check and balance in place, and the rule of law is obviously the scaffolding underneath those checks and balances, we have a problem. So would I like to see, for example, the Republicans in Congress assert their responsibility as part of the checks and balance? You bet. And I think they eventually will. I think the president has every right to push the limits, and the systems have every right to check the push if it's inappropriate. And that's what the courts are doing and others are doing. So I think the checks and balances are working. I think they have been stressed. They were stressed, in 2020 between the election and inauguration. And we've come out of that stress, in my view, understanding and fixing some things that needed to be fixed. We'll come through this period of time and look at what could be done and what should be done differently. And I will just make this point. I mean, there are some things that I don't like what President Trump is doing. Many things I didn't like what President Biden was doing. But I do think the push to the courts and the criticism is right in certainly one area. We have created a system around this country of federal courts where they basically have arguably a local problem. They are the plaintiffs in a case, or let's say fired employees from a Department of Agriculture in Des Moines, Iowa. And that the judge in Des Moines, Iowa, rules in favor and then issues a nationwide injunction to stop that behavior against everybody. That is a problem. And I think both Republicans and Democrats realize a nationwide injunction should be used extremely sparingly. And it has become a use, both Republican appointed judges and Democrat appointed judges. And it's one of those things I think we will, through a bipartisan way over the next several years, fix, because generally no judge should have that authority. It should apply in that court in Iowa, that it should apply in the appellate court, wherever the appellate court decides. And then only when it gets to the Supreme Court should the decision be nationwide. So that's an appropriate push from the president and his staff. And I think an appropriate criticism against the judiciary. I think that will end up playing out better. And I think we'll see some resistance by local judges to apply their rulings nationwide. And I think that would be a good thing. And that will be part of the check and balance built into our infrastructure.
Larry, you're not the only optimist who's been on the show. Another Bay Area optimist is Peter Layden, a very well-connected tech guy, journalist, entrepreneur, innovator. He came on the show a week or two ago suggesting that Trump is unintentionally making America great again because he's essentially destroying the Republican brand. And he makes this argument in his Substack newsletter, The Great Progression. He said, And then perhaps in some ways it's rather like the argument that you and Paul Johnson are making in your new book, What's Right with America, is that American history works in 80-year cycles, and that we're ready for a new cycle. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Leiden's argument. I think he's going to turn it into a book. But do you think there may be some truth in the fact that Trump is destroying the Republican brand? So we're about to undergo another cycle of innovative democratic rule?
I'm not familiar specifically with his work, but I'm familiar kind of with the general concept. And I think whether it's President Trump or whether it's President Biden or President Obama, and you go down the list, I think the alignment of interest and the voters who are supporting the two parties is changing dramatically. The Democrats have become more of a party of the educated class, so to speak, and less about the working class. That's a problem for the Democratic brand, as President Trump and others have moved to a more populist approach. So I think both parties are going to realign. I just wish we would have enough pressure in these systems to basically not have this oligarchy of two parties. It's created so many problems, especially in the local governments. When our American system is so driven off the primary system, and Paul, when you bring him on and you get into this, I mean, he runs the math, but it's basically in some districts across this country, and it's true in the state elected houses too, 8 to 10% of voters living in a district decide who's going to represent.
Yeah, we've done whole shows on that. Someone just wrote a book about the problem with the primary system.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of repair there, and the founders also were quite wise. George Washington, in his farewell address, was pretty clear that parties, he wasn't quite talking about political parties, talking about political interest across the country, were not good for America. And almost 250 years later, we're now wrestling with that again. We in Arizona have tried to pass an open primary system and some would argue it's a ranked choice voting system, and that didn't pass. But voters are pretty smart. I think if they're given the right tools and the right arguments, they'll make some adjustments, and that's part of the check and balance. So whether these are 80-year cycles, I think we're like everything in our life. I think we're accelerating. I think the cycles might be a lot shorter than 80 years, but I think there will be a realignment of the parties because they obviously are today addressing different needs. And, as an ex-businessman, I kind of wonder where are the business people going? Because the populists of MAGA really are not that supportive of business interests. And, I'm a big believer that one part of America's greatness is America's economy and America's capitalistic system. So how do businesses engage in a different way with either party to basically represent the economic side of our country? And that's remains a concern. I don't know how that's going to play out.
Larry, you talk about the Democrats now being made up of what you call an educated elite. Trump seems to be attacking the universities that bring so much value, certainly internationally, in terms of their research. Are the universities one example, the great universities, the Harvards, the Princetons, the Stanfords of the world that are taking on Trump now? They seem to be even forming coalitions against him. Are they one reason why you believe that America still has a glorious future?
I think the American higher education system is the envy of the world. And I think that's a reason why a lot of foreign students want to come here. I worry about some of the efforts to push foreign students to other countries. I think we lose some of the greatest talent on the planet, often who will stay in America if we give them an opportunity. I think President Trump, before he was elected, was saying, why don't we allow students that graduate who come from China or Korea or wherever to stay in America and build their business here? It's the right idea. It's the right conversation. There, like every entity, there are outliers that possibly have gone too far. I think it's kind of tragic. We spent a lot of time on freedoms in our book, and a lot of that's on the First Amendment and on our freedom of speech. And I think a number of universities have really pushed away freedom of speech for everyone, and it's a tragedy. And I think that's a mistake. And I think universities are realizing that and correcting that. And I have leadership in some universities created problems that they're now coming home to roost. By reports, I think they have, and I think that's a correction too. I look at the University of Arizona and the Arizona State here in the Phoenix area, and they both on the various rankings are A-rated freedom of speech universities. They have very little of the current attack from the administration coming to these universities for the right reasons. I mean, they have not had some of what some would say is an Ivy League problem, not completely only Ivy League, but some would say an Ivy League problem. Other universities, and there are thousands across the country, are going every day and educating students, allowing robust debate to occur, and that's what a big part of what makes America great. So yes, do we have some problems? Yes. Is the Trump administration approach to them right? Well, I think there's probably some arguments on both sides of that. I think that will also be, whether that's part of a check and balance or that's just a correction, I think we'll see some corrections. And it will be painful. It will be painful for a number of universities that have to change a lot of what they've built maybe over the last 50, maybe 80 years. And they've gone, and I think many people on the left have said, we've gone too far on some of the so-called wokeness issues. And we need to get it back in balance where 70% of America is. And that's kind of, Andrew, our book. Our book is focused on the 70% of Americans who aren't out on the edges, who aren't out on the polls, who aren't arguing blow up America, as some people on the left have said, who have basically said, on the right have said, throw them all. We just want, people that were born here and are Christian. And I'm a hardcore believer that while the founders created a moral document and were all religious believers at the time, they made it crystal clear that we're entitled to believe what we believe in America, and that's one of our freedoms too.
Larry, you're talking, of course, from Scottsdale, Arizona, one of the border states on what's known as the American southern border. What many people historically have associated with what's right with America is its immigrant society, the fact that it has, certainly since the 1960s, relatively open borders and welcome people who wanted to reinvent themselves in the United States. What's your take on that in terms of this debate about immigration and also this new administration's attempt to throw out many people in this country who at least in their view don't have the legal right to be here?
I am certainly a firm believer in legal immigration. And if we argue legal immigration, we actually have to enable more legal immigration. You mentioned Arizona being a border state. It's a big agricultural state. And a ton of the workers cross the border safely every day and work in the various fields in Yuma and other places. Many of them cross the border every day to do the jobs that many Americans won't do. I've heard some of the MAGA folks say, well, if you just raise their wages, if you just, double their salaries, that, they'll be going up on the roof and doing fixing the roofs and repairing the landscaping. And I just don't think it's true. And I actually don't think it's an aspiration for Americans. Americans should aspire to have real jobs where they can develop some worth for their family and be successful. We shouldn't be aspiring, other than entry-level jobs for a short period of time, Americans to take those jobs. So we need more legal immigration. We need more work permits for those who want to come here, earn money, and go back home. We need to make the doorway both sides when people come here easy to move back and forth just for work purposes. We clearly want to look at those areas that are not just basic manual labor and say, are there jobs that we really want to have more Americans trained for, and how would we do that? But I think one of the things in our 5 traits, one is generosity. And generosity is also generosity in spirit. And what I have seen by some of the folks currently who are talking, I think, in a very inhumane way. And you can argue the politics, you can argue the laws, but when somebody makes a mistake and exports somebody who shouldn't be exported, we should just basically say, "Oops, that was a mistake, and sorry," and we correct the mistake. But to me, the inhumanity is unbelievable, and no one wants gangs who are roving the countryside and killing Americans or anybody here. But that's overblown too, and we know that the data doesn't support that. So I think we need to have a good conversation. We need to have a good conversation with Congress about what do we want in America, what are the rules, and I know administrations for decades have tried and failed because the loud voices on the right and left oppose that, and the loud voices cut through the clutter. For the average person may have 10 minutes a day to hear something around news. We got to figure a better way, and go back to what I think, why I'm optimistic. I think we will. It's been hard. It's been too long. We must solve that problem. We need more people in America. We need more Americans getting better jobs at higher wages, and they shouldn't be aspiring to get a manual job that they could hurt themselves on. So there's a better conversation ahead, but I'm not sure I'll be alive when it actually gets completed.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, Larry, how optimistic you really are. You talk about generosity, but you say that's something that America, one of the 5 attributes of the American people, but you note the lack of generosity that many Americans seem to be feeling towards people living in this country who don't have work permits. All sorts of stories. What would you say to people who would say, well, certainly Americans are no more generous than any other peoples in the world. I mean, the Europeans were more generous in offering asylum to people seeking refuge from the wars of the Middle East. What's so generous about America?
So I think the data still supports the notion that when you look at the number of people that cross our borders legally and illegally, we really are a country that welcomes people coming here. We need a system that keeps us safe. We don't want people crossing the border who have untoward interests in hurting somebody here, bringing violence here. Those are obvious, police, sheriffing, and in some cases military issues. But I think it can be done humanely. I think it has to be done humanely. I think it's if you get back to what I think we're talking to, the 70% of Americans don't think the inhumanity is a good thing. There probably are 30% of Americans who do.
But I should hope so. I mean, you're saying that 30% of Americans are inhumane.
I would say 30%, they haven't probably stepped back and said, okay, we want people out of this country who are creating safety issues for us. That's right. Is it okay that if we were to kill them to make America safe? Of course not. That's okay. I think there might be some people who might think that's okay if they're here illegally. But I think most would say no. And then the question is, so what is humane and what is inhumane? And there are clearly just shooting somebody on our streets is inhumane. And clearly, not doing anything is also inhumane. So in the middle is a choice. And I think most of Americans kind of understand the choice and would be better prepared to understand the cost of the choice and develop a more humane immigration system. And, I'm one of those people that says, if we haven't enforced the borders and people come here for a better life and they're not risking safety of Americans, well, I think we probably should find a way to allow them to stay. I would be in the category of a path to citizenship, but I know so many of my friends don't agree with that. Because why? They came here illegally. That's not right. And it's like, well, of course, Reagan did it, many years ago. And, we could have enforced the borders and had a better policy, but we didn't. And now they came for a better life, and they're farming our fields, and they're taking care of our landscaping. And now we just want to basically send them back to a country that they haven't been to. Like we sent a couple of young kids back who are citizens of America. Andrew, it's an amazingly daunting issue. We all will have an opinion of where the line is, but kind of this is where the individual opinion kind of gets subsumed, one of those rare things, to the collective. We need to have a compromise and an agreement on how we deal with our immigration system and how we do it humanely. And humanely might mean that a portion of those folks do get sent back to countries where they came from. I think sending them back to countries that they transited through doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but no one's hired me to solve the immigration system. Although if I were given all the keys, I think I would solve it. I'm not sure how much of American would agree with my solution.
Larry, the more you talk, the more you sound to me like a Biden Democrat. Your optimism will be infectious to some people. You believe in progress. You're certainly against inhumanity of one kind or another. You're in favor of generosity. Tom Friedman recently had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times, which we discussed in another show, describing himself as a Waymo Democrat. In other words, a Democrat who believed in technological progress. I take your point on the problems of two-party democracy in America, and of course you're right. But people have been talking about this for generations and not being able to reform the system. Might you yourself be a Waymo Democrat, and what's right about America be a new kind of centrism from the Democratic Party, since the Republicans have shifted so sharply and to the right?
Not that you asked, but I will tell you, I don't think I've ever in my life voted federally for a Democrat, so it would be a rare thing. But I think there are elements of both parties that really are focused very on some of those key issues. And I think as we cobble together new political parties, we're going to see whether it's a Waymo Democrat or a new independent group. And we look at the registration data across America, and independents are nearly half of American registered voters. I'm an independent registered voter, and I have been for a long time. Being a libertarian is kind of comical when you finally look at how few people actually run for office, so you don't get to vote in anything remote related to a primary. So I wouldn't call myself I don't really know what a Waymo Democrat is, but I would call me as somebody who's looking for leaders who are trying to solve today's problems and set a foundation for the future, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican. I do not believe we make America great by going back to the past and going back to the 50s. That just, or the 1890s, or whatever our current president has said on tariffs. So, I think we have to go ahead, and when we go ahead, we're going to see differences.
Well, finally, I know you dedicated the book to Jim Click Jr., who's not a young American. Are there any young Americans who, for you, represent reasons to believe again in America? After all, the history of America is of youth and of a youthful country.
I would say it's rare to run across a young American who doesn't inspire me. I mean, they wake up and they go to school or they go to their job and they practice their faith, and they raise their kids, and they want their kids to be educated and have a bigger job and be successful in life. I think everyday Americans, the ones we're trying to talk to, do that every day. And it would be hard for me to run across a young person and spend more than 5 minutes with them and not be impressed about why they are happy to be American.
Well, Larry Aldrich, the co-author of What's Right with America and How We Can Keep It That Way. I hope you're right about being right about America. The book is out in June. Congratulations, Larry. And I hope we'll have the opportunity to talk to Paul Johnson when the book's out. Best of luck with the book, and great to talk. Thank you so much.
Andrew, thank you very much. Thanks to talk to your listeners.